recording this. So I'm going to, hold on one second. Yep, it's recording. So Brent, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Lou. And good morning, everyone. Like Lou said, my name is Brent Suter. I'm a pitcher with the Cincinnati Reds, and it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe was born in Toronto, actually lived a little bit in Colombia when she was younger, graduated from the University of Toronto, studying physics and astronomy there, and then she got her Master's of Science and Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Illinois. And she's gone on to absolutely dominate the environmental landscape, environmental science. She won the UN Champion of the Earth in 2019. She's actually the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and she's been on countless lists of top influential people, top influential scientists. All those lists of high achievement and influence she's been on. But more impressive than anything else for me is she's able to bridge the gap between religion and science. She doesn't make those contrasting or competing ideas. She makes those unified. Evangelical Christianity and environmentalism, she's able to blend, or she's able to unite better than pretty much anyone I've seen on Earth. So that is one of her gifts. I think that it just keeps on giving for the environmental landscape. She's currently a distinguished professor at Texas Tech University, where she lives and with her family. And she is just an inspiration to everyone on this call. I know for me, for sure, she's one of my environmental heroes. And but without further ado, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
And before you hop on, just one quick thing. Make to all of our guests, we have EcoAthletes champions, Katharine. We have some members of our advisory council. And so think of some questions, because Katharine always does a good Q&A. And so now I will hand it over to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
All right. Thank you, Lou, and thank you, Brent, for that awesome introduction. I should also clarify, I am not a professional athlete, as you can tell, but I do love all sports related to snow and water. So I grew up skiing and water skiing, and my favorite thing right now is my electric hoverboard, which is, yeah, it's really awesome on water. And I feel like sports is a huge way to connect with people over climate change, because what we see today, and actually I'm going to just show you a couple of resources that I think are really interesting and really fun for you, and I'll put them in the chat so you can look at them later. But when we look at what people think about climate change now, oh, thank you, making me the co-host. And the Yale program on climate communication is sort of the premier organization that tracks public opinion across the US and around the world. So they do global and they do US data. And I just wanted to share some of their data with you. Just a second here to show why what you're doing is so important. Okay, there we go. Can you see my browser screen there? Yes, it looks like you can. Okay, so you can look at, let's see, counties. We'll go to counties. And this is data that just came out last year. So it's very new. And it asked people across the US, do you think that global warming is happening? And you can see that any county that's orange means more than 50% of people would say yes. So there's literally like maybe, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's just the odd county where it's just barely below 50%, but most people would say that it's happening. And then the researchers asked people, will it harm plants and animals? In other words, is it an environmental issue that matters to the environment, plants and animals, not humans? And as you can see, most people said yes. In fact, it's hard to tell the difference. And the funny thing to me is some of the places that were blue before, they turned orange. So they don't think it's happening yet, but they think if it happens, it would harm plants and animals. Okay, so then they asked people, will it harm future generations? So people in the future. And you get pretty much the same answer here. So people pretty much agree it will harm plants and animals, people in the future. How about people who live in developing countries? The numbers went down just a little bit there, but you can see it's still mostly orange. So people are pretty good with the idea that this is real and it's going to affect things that I don't care about and people I don't know. And then they ask this question, will it affect you personally? Ready? Yeah. So this past year, our headlines have been dominated by bad climate news. We see record warm ocean temperatures. I mean, last summer it was like hot tub temperatures off the coast of Florida. We see record wildfires. We're coming out of the biggest wildfire in Texas's history just last week. We saw record heat waves. Where I live in central Texas now, it was over 100 most of the summer. Thankfully, I'm from Canada, so I get to spend more time up there. But we had the wildfire smoke up there, and it just choked the skies all the way down through Canada, down to New York and even Washington D.C. Around the world, we're hearing about disaster after disaster. And so on social media, that's sort of where I keep track of what people are thinking, what people are saying. On social media, no matter what platform I was looking at, I would see people saying again and again, if this isn't enough to make people take action the way we need to, nothing is. And they said that after the Hawaii wildfires and after the Canadian wildfires and after the Canary Island wildfires and after this and after that, everybody would say, if this isn't enough, nothing is. And so I started to feel like a broken record, because every time I saw that, I would say, that's not the problem. Most people around the world are worried about climate change. In fact, around the world, over 80% of people are worried. Even in the US, like you just saw, 72% are worried. In the state of Texas, where I live, 48% of registered Republican voters are worried about climate change. I mean, if you can get registered Republican voters in Texas to say that, you know that things are changing. Most people are worried, but it's all up here. They're worried about the future. They're worried about the ice sheets and the polar bears. They're worried about the plants and animals. They're worried about the people who live over there. But most people haven't made the head to heart connection, which means that they don't understand how it affects the people, the places, the things they love. And this figure I just showed you, I'll just show it to you again as a reminder. This figure I showed you, this is what this shows. We haven't made the head to heart connection. And so that is exactly where you come in, because you are helping people make the head to heart connection. We have to show people that whatever you already care about makes you the perfect person to care about climate change. So somebody might say, well, I'm not an environmentalist. And I would actually say to them, well, I don't see myself as an environmentalist either. I see myself as an everythingist. I care about this because yes, it affects plants and animals, but it also affects people. It affects the places I love, the things I love, the people I love. And it's gotten to the point now, and this is the bad news, but it's also the good news. It's gotten to the point now where climate change is affecting everybody. We can point to a way that climate change is affecting something that people love, no matter who they are, no matter where they live. So I have this, let me put this, this resource in the chat for you before I forget, because there we go. You can, if you didn't notice, you can zoom in on your state, your county, your congressional district. And they also have maps for Canada. They're a little bit older. And then they have maps from last year that are international as well. And you can look at every country. And the interesting thing is, when you look at every country around the world, you see the same thing I just showed you. Levels of worry are high. Will it affect future generations? Yes. Will it affect plants and animals? Yes. Will it affect you? Boom. Everybody around the world has this head to heart lack of connection. So every week I have this newsletter. Let me share it with you. And I created this newsletter last year because I wanted to try to make this head to heart connection. So every week I talk about how climate change is affecting something that people might care about. Like what? Okay, so last week we talked about fish, if you enjoy eating fish. The week before we talked about coffee. The week before that, coffee and children. The week before that, we talked about chocolate. The week before that, we talked about marginalized communities in the US, Black and Brown communities, and how they're disproportionately affected. We talked about the Super Bowl. We talked about nature. We talked about schools. So I've talked about, gardening, making that head to heart connection. But frankly, for so many people, like if you had to ask me what are the top 5 head to heart connections we could make, sports would be right on that list. Faith would be right on that list, which is why I focus a lot on that as a Christian myself. And, in terms of widespread things, probably kids, like our kids or our nieces or our nephews or kids in our life, that would be on our list too. And then probably also on the list would be places we love, places we identify with. But that relates to sports too, right? Because if you're part of a team sport, whether it's at the professional level or whether it's at the university level, people identify very strongly with the sense of place. So you've actually got 2, not just 1. You practice your sport in a place that people love, whether that's a sport like skiing or a sport like professional baseball, and the sport is something people love too. So this is so important because until we make the head to heart connection, people aren't going to understand why they care here and now. Again, they understand it's a problem. It's going to affect people in the future. It's going to affect people who live over there. It'll affect plants and animals and the environment, but they don't understand why it matters to me. And so that's why making that connection is so important. We could have as many disasters as we could, but if that disaster doesn't actually burn down someone's home, that person still won't understand unless we've made the head to heart connection. But there's one more connection that's really important, and you need to be aware of this one. We also have to make the heart to hands connection. Because when you ask people, how do you feel about climate change? 50% of people feel hopeless and helpless and don't know what to do. And I would venture to say probably 30% are lying about it and saying that they don't feel that way when they do. Because when you ask people, are you activated? Like, are you actually doing something? And by doing something, I don't mean recycling. I mean, are you engaging in climate action, like having conversations about it, or, taking actions to help where you work or your own family or whatever organization you're part of reduce their carbon footprint? Or are you advocating for climate action and contacting elected officials? Not just federal elected officials. Federal elected officials less than 5%. Or 0.5%. 99.5% of elected officials are at the state level or the city level or the school district level. Or in Texas, one of the most powerful people is the railroad commissioner. They control all the fugitive methane emissions from all the oil and gas out in West Texas. So when you ask people, are you activated? What percent of people do you think say that they're activated? Just sort of take a guess to yourself. In the US, 8% are activated. So here's the thing. Do we want people to be worried or do we want people to be activated? Well, if people are worried but they're not activated, they rapidly descend into anxiety, paralysis, and despair. And we could have the whole world anxious, paralyzed, and despairing, and that would do nothing to fix climate change. It would just make our own lives more miserable. I would rather be unaware if there was nothing I could do about it than aware and have nothing I could do about it. It's that movie, Don't Look Up. Did you all see that movie, Don't Look Up? I see a few head nods. Yes, it was a very well-intentioned movie that was a metaphor for climate change about an asteroid coming to hit the Earth. But 99.99% of people on Earth couldn't do anything about it. So they did nothing. All they did was be afraid and then eventually die. Sorry to break the end of the movie to you. It was awful. And so I actually serve on Netflix's sustainability committee. And so after the movie had already been shot, they were still in the editing phase. They actually told me about the movie and I said, okay, hang on here. So you've got the fear and the doom. That's great. Big green check mark on that one. But you haven't made the heart to hands connection. You haven't told people what they could do to make a difference. I said, could you redo the movie a bit so you get to the ending, okay, but then you restart the movie halfway through and show how choices by individual people who are not the president of the US actually completely altered the trajectory and saved everybody? And so they actually said, they're like, oh, well, I don't think Leonardo DiCaprio is available anymore. I think he's gone on to his next project. And I was like, Well, I didn't actually think you were going to do that for me, but thank you for thinking about it. But what Netflix did do as a result of my suggestion is they asked 10 different thought leaders to write alternate solutions for the movie. And they put out those essays because the movie did great on the head to heart. It showed how everybody's life was at risk, completely tripped over its shoelaces and fell flat on its face in making the heart to hands connection. And again, why is that important? Because everybody could be worried, but if we don't know what to do, we'll do nothing. So in my newsletter, I always have good news, I always have not so good news about how climate change is affecting us. And if I talk about something like the Arctic or ocean temperatures, I always make a direct connection to our lives. But then I have good news about what is already being done. And every couple of months, I have good news about what is being done in the sports area. And in fact, let me go back and find specifically the newsletter. I talked about what the Super Bowl was doing to reduce its own emissions, but I had a really fun newsletter. I think it was back in September, where I talked about, here it is. This is the one from back in September, where I talked about what soccer teams are doing. There's just some amazing things that soccer teams are doing, what hockey teams are doing, let's see. I think we talked about I must have other ones too, because I've talked before about what they're doing in golf, what they're doing in tennis. There's just so much about sports. And there was something so cool. After I did this newsletter, the one I just put in the chat, I saw this guy on Twitter who had this account called, his name is Frank, and he had this account called something like, I forget, Football for the Future, or something to do with American football and climate change. And he was posting all of these facts about football and climate change, both head to heart, how climate change was already affecting, the times that kids could practice and the safety and health of the athletes, but then also heart to hands, what athletes and teams and organizations and arenas were doing to make a difference. And so when I saw this, I sent him a message. I said, what you are doing is phenomenal. It's exactly what I talk about with head to heart to hands. I just want to tell you, you're doing a great job. And he said, well, the only reason I'm doing this is because I read your newsletter and got the idea from it. I was just like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Even if that's the only thing that happens, mission accomplished. So when you talk to people, talk about, I think we need to be 50-50. 50% the risks of inaction. But again, not the polar bears, unless your sport is literally riding polar bears, which right. I don't think it is, because they would eat you. It's the risk of inaction to your sport, your athletes, your fans, your city. There's a lot of information about individual cities. In fact, Climate Central is a really good resource. Let's see. They have, Climate Central has this newsletter that you can sign up for. Let's see if I can find, here we go. They have this newsletter you can sign up for. I'm not quite sure where the newsletter sign up is, but somehow I got on it. And every week, Climate Central sends me this email saying, Katharine, in Lubbock this week, and then it gives me some statistic about my city and how climate change is affecting it, or it gives me a statistic about how much wind energy we produced or some other good thing. So you can talk about your place, your sport, your people, your fans, your athletes, talk about how heat or lack of snow, or how climate change is affecting the potential of, where you can hold the Olympics in the future. There's all kinds of things we can talk about that focus on the head to heart connection. But you also need to talk about the heart to hands connection. And that comes in two parts. You can talk about what other people are already doing and what you're doing, and then you can talk about what whoever you're talking to can do. And I think we sort of need a balance of both. People need to understand they're not alone. People have this image of climate action like a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff, and the only person trying to push it up is Greta Thunberg. And as everybody knows, she's this very small girl. That's sort of the image they have. But when you tell them that your team, your stadium, your city, a lot of cities are taking action, or you personally, or this group of eco-athletes, when you tell them that people are taking action, they realize the giant boulder isn't even at the bottom of the hill. It's already at the top of the hill. It's already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It's already got a lot of very strong hands pushing that boulder. And if they join you and add their hand, it will go faster. So that's the impact of sharing what other people are already doing, whether it's growing organic food on the roof of the stadium, whether it's looking, oh, did you hear that the World Cup ski athletes have recently petitioned the World Cup Association, right? They did this a couple of weeks ago to redo the travel schedule. So they're not flying across the Atlantic every week for a race in North America and a race in Europe and a race in North America and a race in Europe. First of all, it's exhausting for the athletes. Second of all, the more you fly, the greater the risk of getting sick often. And then third, the carbon emissions, of course, are just off the charts. And so the athletes are the ones petitioning the organization to just redo the freaking schedule. Like, is this not just the logical common sense thing to do to save money, to save time, to improve athletes' health and quality of sleep? Oh, and to reduce carbon emissions too. There is nothing wrong with having 5 different reasons to do something. So when people ask me, what can I do about climate change? 10 years ago, as a climate scientist, that was a really hard question for me because I'm sort of like I diagnose the problem sort of like a doctor. But then if you ask climate scientists what to do, I'm like, well, that's not my job. That's not what I do. I tell you how bad it is. I tell you how much worse it's going to get, but I don't tell you how to fix it. But I realized if you go to a doctor and the doctor diagnoses you and then you say, well, what am I supposed to do? And the doctor says, I don't know. That's not my job. That's not acceptable. So I realized I had to figure out what the answer was. So, 15 years ago or so, I looked around and I found out, there's a carbon footprint calculator that you can step on and you can calculate your carbon footprint. So I did that myself. I found out that most of my personal carbon emissions were from flying. No surprise for you probably, but for me it was because it was flying to scientific meetings to talk about and study climate change. I was like, well, that's not good. So I set out to transition, and this is way before Zoom. Zoom did not exist in those days. I set out to transition 80% of the talks I gave to virtual talks. And in those days, most people would say, we've never done this before. But most people would say, we're willing to give it a try. There's a couple of people who didn't. Princeton University was one of the ones who said no, but everybody else, most people said yes. And of course, now everybody does stuff online. But then, I'm a scientist. I looked at how difficult it was for me and how much more expensive it was for me, especially at that time, to get solar panels, to get a plug-in car, to figure out ways to reduce our household's footprint. And I realized that most people don't have the knowledge or the resources, and in some cases the money too, to do this, because you have to invest up front, right? So then I calculated, okay, how many people in the US are worried and how many people could reduce their emissions? And I talked to one of my colleagues, Stefan, over in Germany, and Stefan studies ocean currents. So he's been studying how the ocean currents in the Atlantic have been slowing, and he's been studying this for 30 years. Stefan is so dedicated to climate action that when he did his PhD in New Zealand in the 1980s, he's older than I am, he wouldn't fly home to Germany not once that entire time. He missed his sister's wedding. He missed all kinds of other things because he wouldn't fly back in the 1980s. But Stefan said, and he lives in Germany, he doesn't have a car, he bikes to work. Germany is a very environmentally friendly country compared to the US. Stefan calculated that even he can't reduce his personal carbon footprint more than 50%, doing everything he can living in Germany. I actually haven't had a car now for 2 years. I live in Texas though, and I can't reduce my footprint below a certain level either. So I calculated that even if all of us individually did everything we couldn't fix the problem. And so then I was like, okay, well, how are we going to fix the problem? What do I tell people? I also found out that the ecological carbon footprint, the idea of how much of the world's resources we use in terms of land, water, carbon, and more, that was created by 2 sustainability experts, a Swiss guy called Matthias and a Canadian guy called Bill. But British Petroleum was the organization that took the carbon part out of it and made the first carbon footprint calculator. And just this week, the CEO of Exxon was like, oh, well, climate change is all the fault of all those people who use all the fossil fuels. I mean, we just create them, we just make the drugs, we just sell them. It's not our fault if people use them. Oh my gosh, they're burning what we actually create. Oh, the horror. How could they do something like that? They should stop. We'll keep on making the fossil fuels, but they should stop. So for 30 years, the fossil fuel company has been trying to shift the blame to our personal carbon footprints. But the reality is most people don't have the knowledge, the resources, and in many cases, the money to make the switch because fossil fuels are subsidized to the tune of nearly $1,000 per person per year. We have 8 billion people on the planet, and the fossil fuel subsidies that they receive from taxpayer money and from the public resources that they use without paying for them, and the climate damages they cause that we pay for, or insurance companies pay for, the government pays for, almost $1,000 a person, over $7 billion a year. Last year, the fossil fuel companies made record profits, and they used those record profits to double their climate goals. Just kidding. They used them to slash their climate goals. They slashed them. So I realized that the whole concept of focusing on our personal carbon footprint is problematic for a number of reasons. Now, do I do everything I do to reduce my footprint? I do. But we have to change the system so the easiest and cheapest choice for everyone is the best choice, the default choice. When you're replacing your furnace, you just reach for a heat pump. Your HVAC person says, oh, well, now clearly you want a heat pump. You don't want a gas furnace anymore. We need that to be the default, not the, I know that I need a heat pump because I got Katharine's newsletter, but now I have to try to find an HVAC installer and I can't find one in my area. We don't want that to be the situation. We want, heat pumps that run on electricity, by the way, not gas. We want that to be the default. We want electric vehicles to be easier and cheaper than internal combustion vehicles. We want public transportation to be the fastest way to get downtown, not driving. We want healthy fruits and vegetables to be in all of the food deserts instead of packaged stuff that's very unhealthy for people to eat. And to do that, it's not our personal carbon decisions that will change. It's our voices that will change that. If you look, I'm reading a really interesting book that it's not about climate change, but it's about how you change a system. And they spent the whole first chapter talking about slavery. And they said, the abolitionists boycotted sugar because sugar came from the Caribbean islands that were run by slavery. Abolitionists boycotted cotton because cotton came from the southern states that were powered by slavery. But did boycotting cotton and sugar lead to abolition? No. It was people using their voices and fighting for change through advocacy, through action, through having conversations, through, as Bill McKibben says, the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual, through engaging with all of the different organizations they're a part of, where they worked, where they lived, how they voted, who they spoke to. That's how we can make a change. So now, what I've done, let's see, let me show you this. On all of the social media outlets where I can post something, and here is my Threads account, let's see. On all the social media accounts where you can post something, if you'll go there, you'll see that I have posted, if you're worried about climate change and you want to make a difference, here's what you can do. And this is so interesting because it's actually based on an analysis by social scientists that we did to help with Don't Look Up after it was already made, that shows that the most important things you can do are talk about it, join a climate action group and talk about it with a lot of people, consider where you keep your money, because that actually has a huge impact, your investments, your bank, your retirement. A recent calculation showed that if you have $1,000 invested in a savings or checking account in a bank that invests in fossil fuels, that $1,000 produces the carbon emissions equivalent to flying from New York to Seattle every year. $1,000. That was just mind-blowing to me. Spark ideas for change at work and school. Hold politicians accountable, and that is not just federal politicians, and it's not just voting. It is city council. It is state representatives. It is people who run whatever aspect. Even school boards are so important because they determine what kids are learning. And then lastly, reduce your personal footprint and make your actions contagious by talking about them. And I linked to this really great resource. I'm going to put in the chat here too. You can see Leonardo DiCaprio looking very anguished there. It has this list right here. Here's the list, and it has more information on why it matters. I'll put this in the chat here. There we go. And so that's what we have to communicate to people, is that their voice matters. Your voice matters, but their voice matters too, because they are part of something that you're not part of. They might be part of your fan base, but they're also part of wherever they work. They're part of whatever neighborhood they're part of. They're part of whatever Boy or Girl Scout troop their kids are part of. They're part of whatever church they attend, and you're not. So they can have the conversation there. That's what we need to communicate to people, is that they can make changes in their personal life, but they need to talk about them, make them contagious, and encourage whatever circles they're part of to also affect change. And here's the really cool thing. When I ask people before I give talks, I say, how do you feel about climate change? 95% of people say anxious, paralyzed, sad, frustrated, angry, depressed, words like that. And then when I share with them that we have to connect everything that we have in our heads to our hearts and help people connect their hearts to their hands, and each of us has a role to play through using our voice to advocate for change, at the end of my talk, I ask them, how do you feel about climate change again? And between 90 to 95% of people flip to motivated, ready, talkative, hopeful, basically, determined. That's one of my favorite ones, determined, ready to go, because they know what they can do to make a difference. So that is the power of head to heart to hands. It helps people figure out what they can do to move us forward, and that's where we want to be. We want people who are activated, not people who are paralyzed by worry. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. Now, as Lou said, I'm a climate scientist. So if you have any questions about anything across the spectrum related to the science, the impacts, I could even tell you off the top of my head how climate change will affect your region or your city, because that's sort of what I do professionally in terms of my science. Any question at all, have at it.
So, first of all, thank you so much, Katharine. My mind is already like head, heart, hands, sports. So you'll be hearing from us about that. Before I open it up to questions, one thing I want to let Katharine know, and the champions who are here, and as well as our advisory committee. Katharine is one of our 4 EcoAthletes Hall of Famers. We have inducted one per year. Katharine Hayhoe, also Dr. Alan Hershkowitz, kind of the godfather of the green sports movement. Lee Steinberg, agent to football players, the inspiration for Jerry Maguire, who found climate religion in his 70s, and Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. So we are going to announce, this is just for y'all, this is to keep quiet, but it's relevant to what Katharine was talking about. As we are coming up on our birthday, on April 8th, we are inducting a fellow named Kyle Clark, who played ice hockey at Harvard and in the AHL, one level below the NHL. He also is the founder of Beta Technologies, which is a company that is pioneering electric aviation, which is for a lot of athletes, and we were talking about, Katharine was talking about her carbon emissions and reducing flying even before the pandemic and before Zoom was everywhere. Electric aviation can also be a great way to reduce aviation-related carbon emissions when it scales. And if you listen to Kyle's talk that we will share on April 8th, this is not a 20-year down the road thing. Like, they already have planes in the sky 2- and 4-seaters. So, that may be, I think that's something that could also help athletes tell the story. Hey, join us in pushing for electric aviation, the scaling of it. So I just thought I'd let you know. So with that, and he's from Vermont, close to Canada, Katharine. So there you go. All right. So now we have some questions. Sarah Philpott from across the pond, and a channel swimmer, a record-setting channel swimmer. Not to embarrass you, Sarah, you go first, and then we'll come back.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. I can clearly see why so many people change their perception by the end of your talks, because you are incredibly enthusing and infectious. So I can understand why when you speak that people get invigorated. Your talk is incredibly interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to, I have a couple of questions, but I'll say one, and then if there's time at the end, I'll come back to my other one. But yeah, I'm a channel swimmer, and I really started my eco journey when I was channel swimming, and I got told about Seaspiracy on Netflix, which I hope you'll be very familiar with. And I didn't eat much fish beforehand, and certainly after I watched it, I was like, never eating fish again. It took me another 3 years to build up the courage to watch Cowspiracy, which I watched about 2 months ago. And since I watched it, which I have to say for those that haven't, it's not all blood and gore. It really is about the statistics, about the sheer volume. Like you say, you've got 8 billion people in the world. If everyone's eating meat morning, noon, and night, we just have got so many animals on the planet that we are feeding and watering. And it's really all about the statistics. And I have to say, ashamedly, I watched it and I just went, I can't do this anymore. I can't be an eco advocate. I despair. How can we make such a big change? And one of the things in that documentary that's fundamental is that people don't seem to be talking about this. They want to fix the airplanes and the cars and the things in their home, but they're not talking about agricultural issues. And I wondered if you could enlighten us, because I don't know how much you find it comes up in your line of work, and how it actually, if we all stopped reducing our meat and fish, we could potentially all fix this problem with one thing, maybe. Who knows?
I'm so glad you brought that up. So yes, I do know quite a bit about that. And what I have to start by saying is that the guys who produced Cowspiracy and Seaspiracy, I really feel that their hearts are in the right place. They're trying to bring attention to unsustainable practices that are very validly unsustainable. But they went a couple of steps farther than Don't Look Up, in the wrong direction, in my opinion.
Okay.
So Cowspiracy and Seaspiracy both, so one's about eating cows and the other's about eating fish, just for people who know. These are two documentary movies. They both included information that was factually incorrect. They exaggerated, and even in Cowspiracy, like you referenced, they tell people that that animal agriculture is the most important contributor to climate change, and it's not. They counted the CO2 that the cows were breathing out, which is the CO2 that we breathe out, and that's just the CO2 that we just took in from the plants that we just ate. So, and then with Seaspiracy, they said there's no such thing as sustainable fishing, and that's absolutely false. In fact, at the Nature Conservancy, we're working with the Marshall Islands and Walmart, of all people, to create a truly sustainable tuna fishing industry. Sustainable means that you're always going to have the same amount or more of fish that you had in the past. It's not going down, it's staying the same or going up. And that's the only way that people there have to survive as climate changes. It's the only industry they have in that area. And so both movies raised awareness of the fact that we're doing things very badly in many areas, and agriculture is one of those areas. But when you exaggerate and you imply to people that if we just fix these things, we could fix all the problems in the world, that's just not true. So what I really like is I like organizations like Project Drawdown, and I highly recommend them to you. What Project Drawdown has done is they have created a summary of 100 different climate solutions, and they've sort of ranked them and put them together in packages. So they have eating more plants. And this is really important because how we frame it is important. So people, like, I live in Texas. And so if you tell people you can never eat a steak or brisket again, ever, you evil animal consumer, they'd be like, you will rip it from my cold and dying hands. And we just lost somebody. But if we say, eating more plants is really good for you, And, we have such great, dishes that we do here that are so iconic to our region. Have you ever tried this or tried that? Or even, tried some of the meat substitutes like Beyond Meat? Like, it's really delicious. I actually like how it tastes. You want to give it a try? That type of thing can be much more effective. So in Project Drawdown, they have Eat More Plants, but they also have things like practice indigenous land management, which is much better for putting carbon back in the ground. Limited amount of sustainable grazing, not industrial scale agriculture, but limited grazing on land that you can't use to grow anything else, but you can graze it and put carbon back in the soil. Also, food waste. We waste so much food that if food waste were its own country, it would be the 4th biggest emitter of heat trapping gases in the world. Food waste is right up there with the actual direct emissions from animal agriculture, because you're producing the food and then you're not eating it. So it isn't even going to any use. So what I like to say is there's no silver bullet when it comes to fixing climate change. And unfortunately, a lot of people look for silver bullets because they feel so hopeless and so discouraged. So they're looking for a single thing. And I have so many people every day, Sarah, that tell me, if everybody just did X, that would fix climate change. And I'm like, no, there is no X. There's no silver bullet, but there's a lot of silver buckshot. What that means is there's all these little pieces that when we put them all together, it's more than enough to fix climate change. But the reason why people fixate on one thing is because they have no hope and they don't understand how we can change the system. So they just think, if everybody went vegan or if everybody stopped having children, well, okay, actually that would probably fix the problem if there was no more humans on Earth, but we aren't going to go there. Or if everybody, there's people are just passionate about one solution. If everybody did X, that would fix it. The answer is no, but we have to realize why they're doing it. It's because they feel no hope. And when they realize that using our voice to advocate for every type of change in every sector, food, land, electricity, transportation, justice and equity, because people who have contributed the least to the problem are the ones most affected. When we use our voice to catalyze change in every area, it's like a million points of light. There's no searchlight, but there's a million points of light that are far more than we need to illuminate our future. Probably a better analogy than the silver buckshot. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Next question, I'm going to go to Jackie Pieri. Catherine, Jackie is a pro ice hockey player in Italy from the United States, and that's just scratching the surface of the Jackie story.
Hi, Katharine. Thank you for your presentation. I just have 2 quick thoughts before my questions. That stat about the banking is something I didn't realize, and I think it's really interesting when we think about different solutions and how they have this like magnifying, like another order of magnitude effect, and we don't even realize when we're outside of the different industries. So really cool to know. That's one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about for my personal footprint, and I find it really intimidating to try and figure out like where to make my investments more sustainable. But that's a side thought. Second thought, I'm really glad you brought up drawdown, because it actually was part of the inspiration for my master's thesis. I didn't know anything about refrigeration before. I didn't really it's very much an invisible thing in our society, and it was listed as one of the more impactful solutions in drawdown, and that's why I ended up doing my thesis in that field. So, okay, 2 side thoughts. You kind of already touched on my question a bit with Sarah's, but 2 things. So, how do we get outside of the echo chamber in terms of like when we're talking? I feel like sometimes online I'm just talking to myself. My friends and family are always really supportive, but I'm still kind of looked at as like the weird one doing climate things. Not in a disrespectful way, but that's still kind of how it's approached. And then I also wanted your thoughts about like avoiding the shame, I guess. I think a lot of climate activists take this shaming approach. And I think sometimes it's hard to avoid, because once you personally understand how negatively impactful something is, like for example, going vegan, like when you understand like how big of an issue animal agriculture is, it's intuitive to want to like scream it and be like frustrated that other people aren't reducing their meat intake. And like part of your book was about meeting people where they are, and it was something I really enjoyed about like how to be persuasive. So I was just wondering if you had some thoughts on that.
I absolutely do. And in fact, You probably heard me typing there. I was just adding a thread I wrote a while ago on Twitter about exactly that. So when the dominant emotion, I'm going to start at the very bottom. The dominant emotion that most people have about climate change is fear. That is the dominant emotion. And those of us who understand it, the more we understand it, the more fearful it is. And then also the people who oppose climate action, they're opposing it from fear. They fear to lose something, their status, their privileges, their whatever it is, their control. So fear is at the root of the way 99% of us approach this issue. And then how does the fear manifest? For some people, if we feel like we don't know what we can do, like it's real, but I don't know what I can do, the fear can transition into mental health crises, or more commonly, it can transition into, I'll just shove it off. I'll just push it away. I'm just going to say, oh, well, that's just sort of the thing that, like your family, that's the thing you care about, Jackie. But, I have some other things I have to care about, because we feel helpless and we don't know what we can do about it. So that is where a lot of people come in, where they acknowledge that what we're saying is right, but they don't know what to do. And so it's sort of like a soft type of denial, because they're not denying it because they think it isn't real. They're just denying it because they don't know what they can do about it. And our human brain can't sit on something that we're worried about that we don't know how to fix. We just aren't built to do that. So our defense mechanisms kick in. But then if we're also very worried and we're doing everything we can, it doesn't take long before we realize that my personal carbon footprint emission reductions aren't going to fix it. That occurs to us pretty quickly. And so then we start feeling, well, if I'm doing all of this, look at all the people around me who are not. Are they just careless? Are they actually just doing it because they don't, they don't care about this? Or are they actively not doing it because I've told them how important it is and they're still not doing it? And then it is so easy to shame and blame. And it gets even worse, because the more worried we are, and this is what I talk about in this thread, give it a read if you're interested. It's sort of funny and sort of sad too. The more worried people are, the more we want to try to control our circumstances, because controlling is a strong human defense to worry. If we feel like we're under control, and that's often where a lot of eating disorders come from, is the sense of wanting to control something about your body. So we want to control not only our own behavior, but people around us. And we see judging, shaming, and blaming as a way to control people around us. And I get that a lot. I am shamed and blamed all the time by people who are worried about climate change. And I even respond to them the first time. I say, I understand where this is coming from. I understand you're worried. I'm worried too. But attacking me might make you feel better for a microsecond, because it does. It makes you feel better for a microsecond. It's like, I did something. I told them. How dare she? But then it's a zero-sum game, because you're putting someone else down to make yourself feel better for a second. And as you know from my book, it doesn't make that person change ultimately. In fact, I had a climate advocate attack me the other day, and she said, there you are flying around the world. How dare you, talk about climate change? And I said, well, actually, I'm very careful with my travel. I only travel internationally once a year. And when I do, I have piled up so many different events when I travel that the carbon footprint per event, I sort of have a standard of, could I drive there in a plug-in hybrid? Is it the same amount of gas? Like, when I went to Alaska, I had 29 events in order to justify the carbon to go to Alaska. Just before the pandemic, I was in Ireland, and I had, I think, 18 events in 1 week to justify the carbon of going. But when that woman attacked me, and I said, well, I only go once a year, she's like, oh no, I know you go a lot more than that. I follow you. And so I actually sat down and I realized over the last 10 years, no, I'd averaged one a year the last 10 years. But because she attacked me, you know what my reaction was? And I'm sorry to say this, and I'm being very, very honest here. My reaction was like, screw you. I'll go as much as I want. that was sort of my reaction. And so, I mean, so we aren't even producing the change that we want by practicing this behavior. Thank you. I'm glad you're laughing. I'm sort of laughing too, but that was my honest reaction. So what is our goal? Our goal is for people to feel empowered, for people to be excited. And the reason why they're not is because it's all up here. They understand it's real. They understand it's going to affect future generations, plants and animals, people who live over there. They have not made the head to heart connection, and they haven't made the heart to hands connection. And that's our job. It's not to judge what their hands aren't doing. It's to help them make those connections. So I really feel like we have to step back. You know, Jackie, sometimes I even write stuff out and then delete it. Or I have imaginary conversations in my head where I say all the horrible, judgy things I'm thinking, and then I just get them out. So there's like, thinking it isn't bad. You know, it just happens naturally. It's part of who we are as humans. And even if you have to get it out of yourself, get it out of yourself, but don't give it to them, because it's not going to achieve the results that we want. All right, Claire, I think you got your hand up there.
Thanks,
Katharine, do we
Lovely.
have time for 2 more questions?
We do. And I think, I mean, on my calendar, we have 10 more minutes.
Okay,
So-
maybe even 3. Next up, Claire Poole, who is, Katharine, the leader and the founder of Sport Positive Summit, which is an incredible company that hosts a major sports sustainability conference in London every year. She founded the Premier League Sustainability Table, which ranks all of the EPL teams from Tottenham, which is, of course, the most important and greatest team ever, even though they don't win, to other teams on their sustainability. And that's just a smidge of what Claire does. So Claire, you are up.
Lou's like everyone's number one hype man. Number one hype man. And Katharine, you do a million things, but I have had the pleasure of speaking at my event before, online a few years ago. So it's lovely to see you. I guess my question was an extension of Jackie's there as well, just around whenever we talk to athletes, and this kind of extends to sports clubs as well, but it's very, very visible for athletes, is those who are personally very passionate about it aren't speaking out because all they get is the small, loud people online that call them hypocrites immediately. And they also, although we always talk about leading from a place of authenticity, and if you lead with that, you're fine. Now, in the run-up to the Olympics, for example, some of them are going to have to wear shirts with sponsors on that are against their values, but they want to compete in an Olympics and a Paralympics, and that's a trade-off. Have you got any thoughts of that, you know, within the authenticity message and not pissing off sponsors and not upsetting their federations, etc.? How can we help them get past this worry about hypocrisy when they do have to travel long distances for their job and to compete at the highest level? This is, for me, the number one question that comes up in terms of talking out and getting them to activate visibly and share their voice, as you said, and create the head to heart to hands connection. It's the number one thing that comes up for us all the time.
Well, and that's the number one thing that comes up for Taylor Swift also.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Same.
So why it comes up is it comes up because of our obsession with individual action. It's an easy way for opponents of climate action. It's low-hanging fruit for them to shame and blame. They literally just pick the fruit off the bottom of the tree and throw it at you. But everybody who's worried about climate change has been sold a bill of goods. They've been brainwashed to think that personal carbon footprint is the way to fix this. 90 companies are responsible for 70% of the problem since the dawn of the industrial era. 90 companies, and none of those companies are sports companies. Now, a few of them might be the sponsors. So I don't know if Exxon and BP are sponsors. I think not usually, but so that's why this is something I hear a lot from musicians, clearly also. And that's why I think it's really important for you to have people like me, and I'm part of an organization called Science Moms with other scientists who are climate scientists and mothers. And part of what I'm thinking of as Science Moms is, can we partner a science mom with a person or a group of people who just need to have that science backing to stand up on, you know, credibly and say, hey, sure, you said that about me, but here's what my climate scientist says about it. Because we have to be really clear on, first of all, we have to fix the system. The system has to be fixed. You know, a pro athlete could quit and go live off the grid in the Yukon. Would that fix climate change? No, it wouldn't. Would that pro athlete flying to the Olympics and wearing, a Cargill or a BP emblem on their shirt, but talking about climate change and advocating within their organization to not have that badge on their chest next time, will that help fix climate change? Yes, it will. So we have to be very clear, not just about what we're not doing, but about what we are doing. And as you know, I'm very upfront with things. In fact, when I wrote my first climate book, I said, look, here's what I'm not doing. Here's where I live. Here's what I can't do. Here's what I still do. But I said, it's not about personal perfection. It's about changing the system. So here's what I do. And every year I try to add 2 new habits and keep them going. So, and then 2 more the next year and 2 more that next year. But my goal is to change the system so everybody's choice is the easiest, cheapest choice, so that we don't have to fly nearly as much. And when we do fly, we can fly electric or sustainable aviation fuel, so that when we go to the grocery store, it's easy to buy low carbon food. When we want to travel from point A to point B, it's easy to take public transportation or electric vehicles. When we sign up for a power plan, it's all clean, renewable energy. If we want to get power from natural gas, we have to search through the weeds to try to find out how to get a natural gas line into our house anymore. That's what we want to do. So we have to be really clear in our communication about what the end goal is. It's like, imagine you're running the 100 meters and somebody's picking at something that's in the first meter. You're like, dude, I have to get across the finish line. Like, let's focus on the finish line. This is where we're all going together. We really have to use that sports metaphor to help people see that it's the finish line that we're about, and this is how we're going to get there. And so I think there's huge potential for an athlete going to the Olympics with a, unfriendly company badge on their shirt to use their voice to talk about how things can change, how things are changing, how things must change, what needs to be different, what's their vision for what the Olympics would look like in 4 years. How has the Paris Olympics already changed compared to the Summer Olympics before that? What they would like their team to do, or what other teams, this is always good, what other teams are doing. Why aren't we doing what they're doing? Get the competition going. There's so much room, but you're right. Those accusations of hypocrisy have to be confronted right on. And it's much more effective if we bring them up ourselves.
Yeah. Isn't it fascinating though, that even the what you said before about someone saying to you about your flying, as you said, you stand for systemic change, not individual action, but even you are like, hang on a sec, it's just, I know we're short on time, move on, but yeah, that's really helpful, Katharine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next,
All right,
Brianna, basketball, and now working in sustainability and sport for good. Brianna, you're up.
And let's do this. Let's hear from Brianna, Doug, and Francis right in a row, and then I'll just sort of give you one answer to answer everything.
Sounds great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for what you shared today. Super inspiring. And I've loved following your journey. I'm also a Christian. And so it's interesting kind of understanding how to share that messaging within that community as well as being an athlete. My question is, in the US, we're ahead of an election year, like things are more polarized than ever. It kind of always feels like this is the tension in this lead up. We know obviously voting for elected officials that can enact policy change is like hugely important, but also ESG has been super weaponized in the US. Like we're definitely seeing a lot of pushback against sustainability and climate, and it has been weaponized. Like one thing I really admire about you is like understanding how to build bridges and like make, help other people that might be, have different values or beliefs than us to see that climate action is real and activating them towards, or climate change is real and activating them towards action. Anyways, in this year, kind of as athletes, do you have any like 2 or 3 key areas in which we can be engaged? Kind of just thinking strategically about like an election year and how to do this in a way that's able to like incite people towards climate action and do it in in the midst of this climate.
Good question, Brianna. Doug?
Yeah, thanks again, Katharine. This is very, very important conversations. Maybe just you want to get your, I'm in the textile manufacturing business and just kind of curious on your thoughts because you haven't touched much on that, but it's been a lot of environment, and that's actually what got me in the textile industry is environmental. But yeah, just a little bit curious on your thoughts on the fast fashions, the nylons, the polyesters, and how that contributes.
Great. Thank you. And Francis?
Sure. Thank you, Katharine. I study oil and gas methane emissions. And I'm wondering, you mentioned the RRC in West Texas, which hit home close to me, the research that I do. My question is, if there is, when you talk about changing the system, if there is a person, like let's say you were sitting in front of like Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon, like would you change your style of communicating this head to heart to hands when you're confronting someone who represents the system, or would you maintain this, like, he is still a person, I need to inspire Darren Woods the same way I would inspire my grandmother? Or is there a point at which you would use a completely different style of tone when talking to somebody?
Great questions. Oh, I love this. Okay. So Brianna, this year I've been in a lot of discussions about what to talk about during election year. And a lot of experts are saying, communication experts are saying, we really need to make the head to heart connection on how extreme weather is affecting Americans and help them see that this is here and this is now. And we need elected officials at all levels, not just the president, but at every level, who take that seriously. Doesn't matter if they're Republican. In fact, I would prefer in many cases if they're Republican and they take climate change seriously. But we really need to hammer home the here and now. Americans are being affected. Our taxes are being used by this. Our insurance rates are skyrocketing. The air we breathe is being polluted. Our homes are at risk. Just really making it here and now is what I'm hearing. Doug, your question was great, and it relates back to Sarah's at the beginning, because it shows how every aspect of what we do is contributing to the climate crisis. The fast fashion industry is having a huge impact. Primark, I think, is number one. Shein is right up there. Of course, H&M is there too, but they're a bit lower because they've been actually taking quite a bit of action. Not quite enough yet, but quite a bit. Why is H&M taking action? It was because people started to talk about, you said you recycle our clothes, but you're not actually recycling them. You're selling all these cheap items from sweatshops that are completely unsustainable, that are falling apart, that people are throwing out. H&M has actually moved way off the top of the fast fashion list in terms of harmful impacts because people talked about it so much and they're taking action. In fact, I was on a panel with their CEO a couple of weeks ago and I pushed her pretty hard on it. And she gave me a whole list of things they were doing that amazed and shocked me in a positive way. So fashion is part of it, food is part of it, travel is part of it, land use is part of it, our diet's part of it. It's all part of it. And it gives us so many opportunities to make that connection. So lastly, Francis, if I was talking to Darren, for example, the CEO of Exxon, as an individual, I haven't talked to him, but I have talked to many of their chief sustainability officers at Chevron and Exxon and those. I do, as an individual, try to make that head-heart connection, because what I often hear is, well, you know, I want to do more, but these people over there won't let us. And to a certain extent, they're right. Like, they, as a publicly traded company, there are things that they as individuals can't do. So what I try to say is, okay, what more do you want to do? And hear what their plan is for doing more. And then say, okay, well, have you considered also doing this, or look at those people over there? And then say, well, why can't you do those things? And really try to work with them to get it done. But I don't know, I don't know the CEO directly. And so if he actually said to my face, well, it's not my fault, I would throw the head hard out the window. And I would just be like, don't you know that your company is responsible for more emissions than the whole country of Canada since the 1700s? I'm sorry, but I would definitely lose it at that point, because if they're being defensive and they're just blaming other people, then you can't do this. But if he actually said, look, I would actually like to do more and I can't do more, and this is why I can't do more, I would have a genuine conversation about him with that. And in my book, Saving Us, which I think Jackie referenced it, I'll just pop it in the chat here in case you're interested. I actually talk about, I have a whole chapter in my book about a conversation that I had specifically with an oil and gas company and how I approached it. So if you're interested, there's a whole chapter about that now. So thank you, everybody. This is, Francis recommended podcast. That's a great podcast. I've had a couple of newsletters recently about how to electrify your home and save money and improve the quality of the air in your house. So there's so many resources and so many things out there. That's why I have my newsletter, to give people things to talk about every week. And I've got resources on my website, and any other questions you have, all of these give you ways to reach me. Thank you.
Awesome, Katharine. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your insights. And also thank you and your team for featuring our EcoAthletes champions on occasion in your newsletter. And we will continue to give you opportunities to do more as our champions do more. And we will be in touch. And thank you, everybody, for your great questions and your attentiveness, and also for your work on the climate comeback. Because and what Katharine is laying out is how we make that comeback happen. And athletes do comebacks. No one else really accountants, no. Athletes, yes. And you have the power, we have the power to make a difference. Katharine, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you, everyone. This is such a pleasure. See you next time.
You bet.